December 7, 1943, Stalag Two B near Hammerstein in Pomerania. Oberst Hans-Dietrich von Tiesenhausen stood in the corner of the prisoner processing warehouse, watching as Red Cross parcels were distributed to newly arrived British and American prisoners. His attention fixed not on the men, but on a small rectangular tin one American sergeant held up to the light. The label read corned beef, 12 ounces net weight, packed for U.S. Army. The American made a face of exaggerated disgust, said something that made his fellow prisoners laugh, and tossed the tin onto his bunk with visible contempt. Von Tiesenhausen, captured 3 months earlier when his U-boat was depth-charged and forced to surface off Iceland, felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. These Americans were complaining about food, not the absence of food, but the specific type of food they received in abundance. Each Red Cross parcel contained 11 pounds of provisions, including tinned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, and condensed milk. The Americans were ridiculing their rations, while his former crew, if they still lived, were subsisting on black bread mixed with sawdust and soup made from potato peels. The mathematics of German defeat, he realized, were not being written in torpedo hits or battle casualties, but in the simple fact that America could feed its soldiers so abundantly that those soldiers felt entitled to complain about menu variety. What von Tiesenhausen witnessed was merely one fragment of the vast nutritional chasm separating American and German war-making capacity. Between 1941 and 1945, American meatpacking plants would produce over 6 billion pounds of canned meat for military consumption. The Hormel plant in Austin, Minnesota, alone processed 500 million pounds of pork into Spam during the war years. The Libby, McNeill, and Libby facility in Chicago produced 300 million pounds of corned beef. Soldiers received more protein in a single week than many Wehrmacht soldiers consumed in a month, and they complained about it. The collapse of German nutritional assumptions had begun years earlier, in the planning rooms where strategists calculated food requirements for protracted warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Wehrmacht logistics officers operated under doctrines developed during the First World War and refined throughout the interwar period. Their calculations assumed that modern mechanized armies could sustain themselves through rapid conquest, capturing enemy food stocks and exploiting occupied territories for agricultural production. This strategy, called living off the land in military terminology or requisitioning in bureaucratic language, had worked adequately during the invasions of Poland, France, and the Low Countries. The conquered territories of Western Europe provided sufficient agricultural output to feed both occupying German forces and, through forced extraction, supplement rations for the German civilian population. The invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, was planned with the same assumptions. Operation Barbarossa's logistical planning included detailed provisions for seizing Soviet grain stores, commandeering livestock, and exploiting collective farms. German planners calculated that the Soviet Union's vast agricultural territories would not only feed the invading Wehrmacht, but would also provide surplus grain for shipment back to Germany. What they catastrophically failed to anticipate was the Soviets' willingness to destroy food supplies rather than allow German capture. The scorched earth policy implemented by Soviet forces during their retreat systematically destroyed grain stores, slaughtered livestock that couldn't be evacuated, and burned crops in fields. German units advancing deep into Soviet territory found not abundance, but famine. By December 1941, just 6 months into Operation Barbarossa, German forces on the Eastern Front faced severe nutritional deficiencies. The official Wehrmacht daily ration in combat zones called for 700 grams of bread, 136 grams of meat, and smaller quantities of fat, sugar, and vegetables. This provided approximately 3,000 calories daily, adequate for soldiers engaged in moderate activity. In reality, frontline units rarely received full rations. Supply difficulties, partisan attacks on supply columns, and the sheer distance from railheads to forward positions meant soldiers often subsisted on half rations or less. A November 1941 report from the 2nd Panzer Army, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, documented the crisis with brutal clarity. Daily bread ration reduced to 300 grams per man, meat allocations suspended for 2 weeks. Soldiers are hunting rabbits and foraging for frozen potatoes in abandoned villages. Malnutrition is reducing combat effectiveness faster than enemy action. Cases of frostbite increase because malnourished men cannot maintain body temperature. The German food crisis was not merely a result of Soviet scorched earth tactics. It reflected fundamental weaknesses in German agricultural capacity and food distribution systems. Germany in 1939 was not agriculturally self-sufficient. Before the war, Germany imported approximately 20% of its food supply, primarily grain from the Soviet Union and Argentina, meat from Denmark and the Netherlands, and fats from various sources. The British naval blockade, established immediately upon the outbreak of war, cut off most overseas imports. The 1939 German-Soviet trade agreement had partially compensated for this deficit, with the Soviet Union shipping over 1 million tons of grain to Germany between August 1939 and June 1941. The invasion of the Soviet Union terminated this vital food source while simultaneously imposing massive additional demands. The Wehrmacht fielded approximately 3.3 million men in Operation Barbarossa. These soldiers required roughly 9,000 tons of food daily, not counting the hundreds of thousands of horses the army relied upon for transport. Each horse required 12 pounds of oats and 15 pounds of hay daily. An infantry division's 4,000 to 6,000 horses collectively consumed more food by weight than the division's soldiers. The logistical absurdity of feeding millions of horses while soldiers went hungry was apparent to German commanders, but mechanization was impossible due to fuel and vehicle shortages. German agriculture operated under increasing constraints as the war progressed. The Nazi government had prioritized industrial rearmament over agricultural investment during the 1930s. While American farms mechanized rapidly, adopting tractors, combine harvesters, and other labor-saving machinery, German agriculture remained relatively primitive. In 1939, Germany had approximately 540,000 tractors compared to America's 1.6 million. German farms relied heavily on human and horse labor, precisely the resources most needed by the military. The conscription of farm workers into the Wehrmacht created immediate agricultural labor shortages. By 1942, German agriculture depended extensively on forced labor, prisoners of war, and civilians deported from occupied territories. These workers, poorly fed and housed, had every incentive to sabotage production and no motivation to maximize output. The agricultural yield from forced labor was invariably lower than that from free workers, yet Nazi ideology prevented Germany from adopting rational labor policies that might have increased production. The German food situation worsened dramatically during the winter of 1941 to 1942. Severe cold destroyed crops in Germany proper. The failure to capture Moscow meant Wehrmacht units on the Eastern Front could not access Soviet grain reserves stored in the capital. The siege of Leningrad, rather than yielding food stocks, created a humanitarian catastrophe that tied down German forces without producing any logistical benefit. By spring of 1942, German planners understood that Germany could not sustain a multi-front war through its own agricultural production. The solution, they believed, lay in capturing Soviet agricultural regions, particularly Ukraine, the so-called breadbasket of Europe. Summer offensive operations in 1942 aimed explicitly at capturing the wheat fields of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The objectives were not primarily military in the traditional sense, but economic and logistical. The Wehrmacht did capture vast Soviet territories in 1942, including most of Ukraine and significant portions of the Caucasus. Yet these conquests failed to solve Germany's food crisis. Soviet scorched earth policies had destroyed much agricultural infrastructure. German occupation was brutal and exploitative, creating resistance movements that attacked supply lines and disrupted food collection. The Nazi policy of starving Soviet prisoners and civilians to feed German soldiers generated such hatred that occupied populations actively sabotaged German food requisitioning. Most significantly, even when German forces successfully collected grain from occupied territories, transporting that grain back to Germany or forward to combat units proved nearly impossible. Soviet rail systems used different track gauges than European railways, requiring either regauging of track or transloading of cargo at junction points. Partisan attacks continuously disrupted rail lines. The sheer distances involved meant that food shipments often spoiled or were consumed by rear echelon personnel before reaching frontline units. By late 1942, Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front were receiving daily rations, providing fewer than 2,000 calories, well below the minimum necessary for men engaged in combat operations. Soldiers foraged constantly, hunting, stealing from civilians, and trading personal possessions for food. Malnutrition became endemic, reducing resistance to disease and degrading combat effectiveness. A secret report from Army Group South documented 12,000 hospitalizations for nutritional deficiencies in October 1942 alone. These were not combat casualties, but soldiers incapacitated by hunger. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American food production was accelerating to levels German planners considered impossible. The United States in 1939 was already the world's largest agricultural producer, with vast mechanized farms producing enormous surpluses. American entry into the war on December 7, 1941, triggered agricultural mobilization as dramatic as industrial mobilization. The Department of Agriculture coordinated with the War Department to ensure military food requirements would be met while maintaining adequate civilian supplies. American farms, already mechanized, increased production through intensive cultivation, expanded acreage, and technological innovations. Between 1939 and 1945, American agricultural output increased by 25% despite losing farm workers to military service and war industries. This productivity increase was possible only because American agriculture had mechanized during the 1920s and 30s. Tractors replaced horses, liberating land previously needed to grow animal feed. Combine harvesters reduced labor requirements for grain production. Mechanized corn pickers and cotton harvesters boosted yields while requiring fewer workers. American farms operated as industrial enterprises, applying mass production principles to agriculture in ways German planners could barely comprehend. The scale of American meat production particularly shocked German intelligence analysts. Before Pearl Harbor, American meatpacking plants processed approximately 20 billion pounds of meat annually for domestic consumption. Military mobilization required diverting billions of pounds to armed forces while maintaining civilian supplies. The industry response was to dramatically increase production while simultaneously implementing efficiencies that reduced waste. The Swift & Company plant in Chicago, one of dozens of major meatpacking facilities, processed 12,000 hogs and 3,000 cattle daily during peak war production. The Armour facility in Omaha processed similar volumes. Hormel in Austin, Minnesota, ran 3 shifts continuously, 7 days per week, producing the canned pork product that would become legendary as Spam. These were not isolated facilities, but representative examples of an industry that spanned the continent. Between 1941 and 1945, American meatpacking plants would produce over 16 billion pounds of meat for military consumption alone, separate from civilian supplies. This represented more meat than the entire German population, military and civilian combined, would consume during the same period. The logistics of processing, preserving, and distributing this protein required industrial capabilities that Germany simply did not possess. Canning technology, developed in the 19th century but perfected during the early 20th century, allowed meat to be preserved indefinitely without refrigeration. This was essential for supplying forces operating in tropical climates, where fresh meat would spoil within hours. Libby, McNeill, and Libby, founded in Chicago in 1868, had pioneered canned meat products. By 1941, the company operated multiple facilities producing canned corned beef, roast beef, and various other meat products. The corned beef that the American prisoner had so contemptuously dismissed in that Stalag warehouse was produced through processes refined over decades. The production method for corned beef began with selecting beef brisket, a cut from the lower chest of cattle. The meat was trimmed, cured in a brine solution containing salt, sugar, and sodium nitrite for 5 to 7 days, then cooked, chopped, and packed into 12-ounce cans. The sealed cans were then pressure cooked at temperatures exceeding 240 degrees Fahrenheit, sterilizing the contents and ensuring shelf stability for years. Each can contain approximately 320 calories, 24 grams of protein, and 24 grams of fat. A single can provide nearly 1/4 of a soldier's daily protein requirement and could be consumed cold if necessary, though it was generally heated before serving. The Libby facility in Chicago alone produced 120 million cans of corned beef between 1942 and 1945, averaging 900,000 cans monthly during peak production. This was accomplished using assembly line methods that processed cattle with industrial efficiency. The entire process, from slaughter to sealed, took less than 3 days, and the facilities operated continuously. German intelligence reports documenting American food production capacity were dismissed by Nazi leadership as propaganda or exaggeration. The numbers seemed impossible. How could a single meatpacking facility produce more canned meat in a month than Germany's entire canning industry produced in a year? The answer lay in industrial scale, mechanization, and organizational efficiency that German industrial structure could not replicate. Germany's food canning industry remained fragmented among hundreds of small regional companies. The Nazi government's attempts to rationalize and centralize production founded on bureaucratic infighting between competing agencies, each jealously guarding their authority. The Reich Ministry of Food and Agriculture competed with the Wehrmacht Supply Office, which competed with the Ministry of Economics, which competed with Göring's 4-year plan organization. Coordination was nearly impossible. American food production, in contrast, operated through voluntary cooperation between private industry and government agencies. The War Production Board allocated materials, the Office of Price Administration controlled inflation, and the Department of Agriculture coordinated production, but actual operations remained in private hands. Companies that had competed fiercely in peacetime became partners in wartime production, sharing techniques and facilities to maximize output. This public-private cooperation, combined with American industrial scale, produced results that German systems could never match. The Quartermaster Corps, responsible for feeding the United States Army, worked with agricultural and industrial producers to develop rations optimized for nutritional content, durability, and ease of transport. The result was a bewildering variety of ration types, each designed for specific circumstances. The A ration, served in garrison or rear areas, consisted of fresh or refrigerated food prepared in field kitchens. The B ration used canned, packaged, or preserved foods requiring cooking. The C ration, individual canned meals requiring no preparation, became the standard field ration for soldiers in combat. The D ration, a fortified chocolate bar, provided emergency nutrition. The K ration, a lightweight package containing breakfast, lunch, and dinner components, supplied soldiers during mobile operations. Each ration type was carefully formulated to provide 4,000 calories daily, exceeding the Wehrmacht's planned ration by 1/3 and far exceeding what German soldiers actually received after 1942. The C ration, which would become synonymous with American military food, deserves particular attention because it epitomized American industrial food production capability. Adopted in 1943 to replace the earlier reserve ration, the C ration consisted of 6 12-ounce cans comprising 3 meals. Each meal included 1 M unit, the meat component, and 1 B unit containing bread, dessert, and accessories. The M unit varieties included meat and beans, meat and vegetable stew, meat and spaghetti, ham and lima beans, chicken and vegetables, and the controversial corned beef hash. Each contained between 280 and 340 calories, primarily from protein and fat. The meat content ranged from 40 to 60% depending on variety, with the remainder consisting of vegetables, beans, pasta, or potatoes. The B unit contained crackers or biscuits, a compressed cereal bar, sugar tablets, chewing gum, cigarettes, toilet paper, and water purification tablets. Later versions included candy, beverage powder, and matches. The complete sea ration provided between 3,000 and 3,200 calories daily and could sustain soldiers indefinitely without access to any other food source. The production scale required to supply sea rations to millions of American soldiers strained even American industrial capacity. At peak production in 1944, American canneries produced over 150 million sea ration cans monthly. This required processing 25 million pounds of meat monthly just for sea rations, separate from other ration types and civilian consumption. The meat came from cattle, hogs, and chickens raised on American farms, slaughtered in American packing plants, processed in American canneries, and shipped to Europe, the Pacific, and every theatre where American forces operated. The logistics of distributing this food were as impressive as its production. Each sea ration case containing 6 complete meals weighed 18 pounds. An infantry division of 15,000 men consuming sea rations exclusively required 7,500 cases daily, totaling 67.5 tons. Multiply this across dozens of divisions operating globally, and the transportation requirements become staggering. Yet American logistics systems delivered these rations reliably, ensuring soldiers received adequate food regardless of location. German prisoners of war encountering sea rations for the first time experienced cognitive dissonance that many found difficult to articulate. Lieutenant Werner Krebs, captured in Tunisia in May 1943, described his first sea ration meal in a diary entry dated June 3, 1943. "We were issued American rations today. Each man received 3 small cans for the day's meals. I opened the dinner can labelled meat and beans. The contents looked unappetizing, but after heating over a small fire, it was edible. More significantly, the portion was substantial. I estimate the can contained 200 grams of meat and 100 grams of beans. This single can provided more meat than I had received in the previous week as a German soldier. My fellow prisoners and I discussed this quietly. If America feeds its prisoners this well, how do they feed their soldiers? The answer is evident: they feed them better. We have lost this war. The realization comes not from military defeats, but from this tin of beans and meat. The psychological impact of American food abundance on German prisoners cannot be overstated. Men who had endured months or years of semi-starvation, who had watched comrades die from malnutrition-related diseases, who had committed acts they would later struggle to justify, all in service of a regime that promised victory, suddenly confronted undeniable evidence of German inferiority in the most fundamental measure of national power: the ability to feed one's population. The contrast became even more stark when German prisoners learned details about American agricultural production methods. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, captured at Monte Cassino in May 1944, worked on a prison labor detail at a farm in Kansas during summer of 1944. His letters home, intercepted and copied by censors, provide remarkable insights into his psychological transformation. "I am working on a farm that produces wheat. The farmer owns 640 acres, which he farms with his 2 sons and myself as the only laborers. They use 3 tractors, 2 combines, and various other machines. Last week we harvested the entire wheat crop in 4 days. The yield was approximately 40 bushels per acre, totaling over 25,000 bushels. The farmer complained this was below average due to dry weather. In Germany, this single farm's output would feed a town of 5,000 people for a year. The farmer sells his wheat and will plant winter wheat in autumn. He owns an automobile, a truck, a radio, and his house has electric lighting and indoor plumbing. His sons, both of military age, were exempted from service because farming is considered essential. In Germany, every able man was conscripted, leaving farms to be worked by women, old men, and forced laborers. Here they understand that food production is as vital as ammunition production." The mechanization disparity Hartmann observed was representative of the fundamental agricultural gap between America and Germany. American farms in 1944 operated an average of 1 tractor per 75 cultivated acres. German farms averaged 1 tractor per 400 acres, This 5-to-1 mechanization advantage meant American farms produced vastly more output per worker, freeing labor for military service and war industries while maintaining agricultural production that fed both military forces and civilians abundantly. The efficiency extended beyond mechanization to include scientific agriculture. American agricultural colleges, land-grant universities established under the Morrill Act of 1862, had spent decades developing improved crop varieties, soil conservation techniques, pest control methods, and animal husbandry practices. The result was agricultural productivity that increased continuously even as labor inputs decreased. German agriculture, while possessing excellent scientific knowledge, failed to systematically apply that knowledge at scale. The Nazi regime's emphasis on racial ideology over practical efficiency led to policies that actively hindered agricultural productivity. The persecution and murder of Jewish agricultural scientists, the rejection of Jewish physics and other scientific advances associated with Jewish researchers, and the general subordination of rational planning to ideological considerations all degraded German agricultural performance. The American emphasis on nutritional science represented another area where German planning proved inadequate. The United States Army Quartermaster Corps employed teams of nutritionists, chemists, and physicians who carefully formulated rations to provide not just calories, but balanced nutrition, including proteins, vitamins, and minerals, essential for maintaining health under combat conditions. The C rations' inclusion of vitamin-fortified components reflected understanding that soldiers required more than just caloric energy. Vitamin C from tomato products prevented scurvy. B. Vitamins from meat and grains maintained nervous system function. Vitamin D, added to some components, supported bone health. This scientific approach to nutrition was largely absent from German military planning. Wehrmacht rations, when available in full quantity, provided adequate calories, but often lacked nutritional balance. The heavy reliance on bread and potatoes, with limited meat and virtually no fresh vegetables after the first months on the Eastern Front, led to widespread vitamin deficiencies. Cases of scurvy, a disease of severe vitamin C deficiency that had largely disappeared from modern armies, reappeared among German troops during 1942 and 1943. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency affected thousands of soldiers. Pellagra, caused by niacin deficiency, appeared in units subsisting primarily on corn-based rations in southern Europe. The German military medical services documented these nutritional diseases, but could do little to prevent them. The food simply was not available. Medical officers requisitioned vitamin supplements, but pharmaceutical production capacity was insufficient to supply millions of soldiers. Fresh fruits and vegetables could not be transported to frontline units, operating hundreds or thousands of miles from supply bases. The Wehrmacht's solution was to accept malnutrition as inevitable and focus medical resources on treating combat casualties. American forces faced no such trade-offs. The abundance of American food production meant military nutritionists could design ideal rations without compromise. If a ration formulation required fresh citrus for vitamin C, the logistics system delivered fresh citrus. When nutritionists determined that soldiers required more protein, meatpacking plants increased production. This ability to translate nutritional requirements directly into supply reality represented a form of military power that Germany could never match. The irony that American soldiers complained about their rations, the very rations that German soldiers would have considered luxurious, was not lost on German prisoners who witnessed this firsthand. Feldwebel Otto Schreiber, captured in France during August 1944, worked in an American supply depot near Cherbourg during autumn of that year. His assignment involved unloading supply ships and organizing materials for forward shipment. The experience profoundly affected his worldview. "I spent today unloading crates of sea rations from a Liberty ship. Thousands upon thousands of crates, each containing 12 complete meals. The American soldiers doing this work complained constantly about the food. One soldier told me he was sick of that corned beef garbage and would rather starve than eat another can of ham and eggs. I did not tell him that I had watched men die fighting over a loaf of moldy bread in Russia. I did not tell him that my brother, last I heard, was subsisting on 600 calories daily at the Leningrad siege lines. I simply nodded and continued working. These Americans have no concept of hunger. They have never experienced true deprivation. Their complaints about food quality when they have unlimited quantity shows they have already won this war. An army that can afford to complain about menu variety cannot be defeated by an army that would kill for those complained about rations. Schreiber's observation cut to the heart of the psychological dimension of the food disparity. German soldiers, even those not yet captured, understood through letters from home, through observations of captured American supplies, and through direct combat experience that American forces operated under entirely different logistical constraints. When German units overran American positions and captured supply dumps, the contents confirmed what many had suspected. The Americans wasted food on a scale that seemed criminal to hungry German soldiers. After the failed Ardennes offensive in December 1944, German soldiers who had briefly captured American supply depots before being pushed back reported finding warehouses full of food that Americans had simply abandoned during their retreat. Gefreiter Hans Müller, who participated in the offensive with the 1st SS Panzer Division, later told American interrogators about discovering a supply depot near Malmedy. "We found a depot containing thousands of cases of rations. There was more food in that one building than our entire division had received in the previous month. We loaded every available vehicle with food, knowing this might be the last decent meal we would eat." The Americans had abandoned it without attempting to destroy the supplies, as if food had no value to them. We also found cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, all things we had not seen in years. For 2 days we ate like we had not eaten since before the war. Then the American counterattack came, and we were pushed back. The food we could not carry was left behind, and we returned to starvation rations. That brief taste of American abundance made our deprivation harder to bear. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last major attack in the West, had been planned partially on the assumption that captured American supplies would sustain German forces. Hitler's operational planning explicitly calculated that German units would seize American fuel, ammunition, and food stocks as they advanced. This assumption reflected desperation rather than sound military planning. Armies that depend on capturing enemy supplies to sustain operations have already lost. The offensive's failure demonstrated not just military defeat, but the complete collapse of German logistics. German units that began the attack with minimal rations exhausted their supplies within days. The captured American stocks, while temporarily useful, could not be systematically exploited because German logistics lacked the transportation capacity to collect and redistribute captured materials. American forces, withdrawing in the face of the initial German breakthrough, evacuated or destroyed most supplies before German units could capture them. The food that German soldiers briefly enjoyed represented a fraction of American stocks in the theatre, stocks that were replenished faster than combat consumed them. By January 1945, German rations on all fronts had deteriorated to levels that made sustained military operations impossible. The official daily ration had been reduced multiple times. Bread allocations fell to 400 grams daily. Meat rations, once 136 grams daily, now came irregularly in quantities of 50 grams or less. Fat allocations, essential for maintaining body temperature in winter conditions, were reduced to 15 grams daily, 1/3 of the previous standard. Soldiers supplemented official rations through foraging, barter, and theft, but these methods provided unpredictable nutrition. The result was an army that was quite literally starving. Medical reports from the Eastern Front in early 1945 documented systematic malnutrition affecting combat effectiveness. Soldiers lacked the physical stamina for sustained combat. Wound healing was delayed due to protein deficiency. Disease rates soared as malnourished immune systems failed to fight infections. Mental acuity declined, affecting decision-making and reaction times. An army must be fed before it can fight, and Germany could no longer adequately feed its soldiers. The contrast with American forces operating in the same European theatre during the same winter could not have been more stark. American soldiers received full rations, providing 4,000 calories daily. Hot meals were served whenever tactical situations permitted. When combat prevented hot food preparation, sea rations ensured adequate nutrition. American medical services reported malnutrition rates approaching zero among combat troops. The few cases of nutritional deficiency among American forces typically involved individuals with pre-existing medical conditions or those cut off from supply lines for extended periods. German prisoners, arriving in Allied custody during the final months of the war, were often in such poor physical condition that immediate medical treatment was necessary before they could even be properly processed. Doctors examining these prisoners found evidence of long-term malnutrition that would require months of rehabilitation to reverse. Many German soldiers weighed 30 to 40 pounds less than healthy body weight. Muscle wasting was universal. Vitamin deficiencies had caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, skin lesions, and neurological symptoms. These were not just combat casualties, but the wreckage of a logistics system that had completely failed. American military doctors treating German prisoners were shocked by the extent of malnutrition. Captain Robert Harrison, a U.S. Army physician who processed prisoners in France during March 1945, documented his observations in a report that was later declassified. The German prisoners arriving this week are in the worst physical condition I have encountered during my service. Average weight is 130 pounds for men who should weigh 165 to 175 pounds. Signs of chronic malnutrition are universal. Many show symptoms of scurvy, despite this being the 20th century. When we provide them with American rations, they eat with a desperation I find disturbing to witness. Several have become ill from eating too much too quickly after prolonged starvation. We now feed new arrivals small portions at frequent intervals until their digestive systems can handle normal quantities. These men are not just defeated soldiers, they are victims of a logistics system that failed catastrophically. The German logistics failure extended beyond frontline troops to affect the entire military structure. Rear echelon units, garrison troops, and even headquarters staff experienced declining rations as the food situation deteriorated. The Nazi regime prioritized combat troops for what food was available, but even priority allocations proved inadequate. The result was a military organization consuming itself, unable to maintain the physical strength necessary for sustained operations. The irony was that Germany had started the war with substantial food reserves and access to agricultural resources from conquered territories. The failure to maintain food supplies reflected systemic problems that no amount of military skill could overcome. The fragmented administrative structure that divided authority between competing Nazi organizations meant coordination was nearly impossible. Corruption was endemic, with Nazi party officials diverting food to black markets for personal profit. Transportation systems, under constant air attack and hampered by fuel shortages, could not deliver available food to where it was needed. Most fundamentally, German agricultural productivity could not support both the civilian population and a multi-million-man military fighting on multiple fronts thousands of miles from home. American observers studying the German food crisis during and after the war identified the root cause as a failure of industrial organization rather than a lack of resources. Germany had possessed adequate agricultural potential, captured vast territories with substantial food production, and employed millions of workers. Yet the Nazi system proved incapable of organizing these resources effectively. The comparison with American food logistics was damning. The United States fed not only its own 12 million man military and 130 million civilians, but also provided substantial food aid to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies through Lend-Lease. Between 1941 and 1945, America shipped over 16 million tons of food to allies, including 4 1/3 million tons to Britain and 4 1/2 million tons to the Soviet Union. This represented food that exceeded American domestic and military needs. Surplus that was produced specifically to support allies. The ability to produce surplus for export while maintaining abundance at home demonstrated economic capacity that Germany could never approach. The Lend-Lease food shipments to the Soviet Union deserve particular attention because they helped sustain the Red Army that ultimately destroyed the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. American shipments to the Soviet Union included 610,000 tons of sugar, 782,000 tons of meat products, over 1 million tons of wheat, 532,000 tons of fats, and vast quantities of canned goods, dried fruits, and other preserved foods. This American food helped prevent Soviet collapse during 1941 and 1942, when Soviet agricultural production fell dramatically due to German occupation of prime farming regions. Soviet soldiers advancing westward after Stalingrad were sustained partly by American spam, canned beef, wheat, and sugar. The irony that American food contributed to Soviet military success that destroyed German armies was not lost on German prisoners who learned of Lend-Lease details. They had been fighting a two-front war against enemies, both supplied with American food, while their own rations steadily decreased. Hauptmann Friedrich Becker, captured on the Eastern Front in January 1945, encountered American Lend-Lease rations while in Soviet custody, before being transferred to American control. His account, recorded during debriefing, revealed the psychological impact. The Soviet guards sometimes ate American canned meat in our presence. They made a point of showing us the labels, packed for export by United States Department of Agriculture. They told us that American food had helped them survive the German siege and was now fueling their advance into Germany. The realization that we were fighting enemies supplied by the same American industry was deeply demoralizing. We could not match the productive capacity of one adversary, yet we were fighting that adversary plus another enemy also supplied by them. The mathematics of our defeat had been inevitable from the moment we declared war on America. The mathematical reality Becker referenced was stark and undeniable. American agricultural production during the war years totaled approximately 200 million tons of grain, 16 billion pounds of meat, and proportional quantities of every other food category. This fed 130 million American civilians, 12 million American military personnel, and provided 16 million tons for Allied aid. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 35 million tons of grain annually at peak, with production declining throughout the war due to labor shortages and reduced fertilizer availability. German meat production totaled approximately 4 billion pounds annually, less than 1/4 of American output, despite Germany's population of 80 million being over half of America's 130 million. When one considered that Germany was also attempting to feed occupied populations and millions of forced laborers, while America fed only its own citizens and military, the disparity becomes even more extreme. Germany was attempting to wage total war while producing 1/5 of its principal adversary's food supply. The biological impossibility of sustaining such a conflict was apparent to anyone who examined the statistics, yet Nazi leadership had launched the war anyway, convinced that rapid victory would render logistics irrelevant. The failure of rapid victory meant Germany faced a protracted conflict its agricultural base could not sustain. Every additional month of warfare pushed German soldiers and civilians closer to starvation, while American forces maintained abundance that allowed troops to complain about menu options. The end game of the European War in spring 1945 provided the final, devastating evidence of the food disparity. German soldiers, surrendering in huge numbers, were fed by their American captors, often receiving more food in Allied custody than they had eaten in months of German military service. The photographs of German prisoners eating American rations became powerful propaganda images, showing defeated enemies being treated humanely, even as their own regime had starved them. For the German prisoners, the experience of adequate food after prolonged hunger was overwhelming. Many later recalled that their first meal in American custody was the moment they understood Germany had lost not just militarily but civilizationally. A nation that could not feed its soldiers, while its enemies fed even enemy prisoners abundantly, had failed at the most fundamental task of any society. General-Lieutenant Heinrich von Lüttwitz, captured during the final weeks of the war, spent time in American custody before repatriation. His memoirs, published in the 1950s, included reflections on the food situation that reveal how deeply the disparity had affected German military thinking. We had calculated everything except American productive capacity. We knew their industry could outproduce ours, but we believed our superior military skill would achieve victory before industrial capacity became decisive. We failed to understand that modern warfare is as much about logistics as tactics. An army that is well-fed, well-supplied, and confident in its logistics will defeat a starving army regardless of tactical skill. The Americans proved this conclusively. Their soldiers may have lacked our combat experience initially, but they learned quickly and always fought with full bellies. Our soldiers, even the most experienced veterans, grew progressively weaker from malnutrition until they could no longer fight effectively. I watched divisions that had fought brilliantly in Poland, France, and Russia, reduced to shadows of themselves, not by combat losses but by starvation. The post-war analysis conducted by American military historians confirmed what German generals had learned through bitter experience. Modern mechanized warfare required logistics systems capable of sustaining massive material consumption continuously. The side with superior logistics would prevail regardless of tactical considerations. Food, while less dramatic than tanks or aircraft, was equally essential. An army must eat before it can fight, and Germany had lost the ability to adequately feed its forces by mid-war. The American emphasis on logistics, often dismissed by German commanders as unimaginative and wasteful, proved to be strategically decisive. The massive supply systems that German officers had mocked, the redundant transportation networks, the enormous supply dumps, and the seemingly wasteful abundance all contributed to military success that German tactical brilliance could not overcome. The complaint about corned beef that had struck Oberst von Tiesenhausen so forcefully in that Stalag warehouse in December 1943 was emblematic of a deeper truth. American soldiers felt entitled to complain about food quality because food quantity was never in doubt. That psychological security, the confidence that logistics would never fail, was itself a form of military power. Soldiers who trust their supply systems fight differently than soldiers who fear starvation. They advance more aggressively, knowing resupply will arrive. They defend more stubbornly, confident that ammunition and food will reach them. They surrender less readily because captivity does not promise better treatment than military service. German soldiers, in contrast, fought under growing certainty that their logistics were failing. They hoarded food when possible, knowing official rations were inadequate. They retreated more readily because forward positions could not be supplied. They surrendered more willingly because Allied captivity promised better food than German military service. This psychological dimension of the food crisis degraded German military effectiveness in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The few German military leaders who fully grasped the logistics situation before the war's end understood that defeat was inevitable. General der Infanterie Hans von Obstfelder, who commanded various corps and armies throughout the war, later wrote about the moment he understood Germany could not win. It was not after a lost battle or a strategic reverse. It was in November 1944 when I reviewed supply reports for my corps. Food allocations were 1/3 of minimum requirements. Ammunition was rationed so strictly that artillery could not provide adequate support. Fuel shortages meant tanks could not maneuver. I compared these figures with intelligence reports on American supply levels. The Americans had effectively unlimited supplies. Their soldiers ate better than our generals. Their tanks had more fuel than they could use. Their artillery fired more ammunition in one barrage than we received in a month. At that moment, I knew we were not fighting a war. We were watching our army starve while our enemies grew stronger. Defeat was not possible. It was inevitable. The statistics compiled after the war confirmed what German commanders had recognized too late. American forces in Europe consumed approximately 45,000 tons of supplies daily during peak operations, including 10,000 tons of food. German forces, fighting on all fronts, received less than 30,000 tons of all supplies daily, including perhaps 3,000 tons of food inadequate to maintain military effectiveness. This 3-to-1 overall supply advantage and greater than 3-to-1 food advantage compounded over months and years to produce an insurmountable disparity. American soldiers advanced on 4,000-calorie diets that maintained physical strength and mental sharpness. German soldiers retreated on fewer than 2,000 calories that left them weak, slow, and increasingly susceptible to disease and injury. The medical consequences of chronic malnutrition reduced German combat effectiveness as surely as battlefield casualties, but without the dramatic impact that might have forced Nazi leadership to confront the logistics crisis. The gradual degradation of physical capability meant units simply performed more poorly over time. Attacks lacked vigor, defenses crumbled more easily, marches took longer, soldiers required more rest. All of these effects were attributed to combat fatigue or declining morale, rather than the malnutrition that was their root cause. American military doctors, examining German prisoners and reviewing captured medical records after the war, documented the systematic malnutrition that had affected virtually all German military personnel during the war's final 2 years. The evidence was undeniable in skeletal remains, medical reports showing epidemic vitamin deficiencies, and testimony from thousands of prisoners who described months or years of inadequate food. The contrast with American forces who maintained healthy body weight, excellent dental health from adequate nutrition, and physical stamina that allowed sustained operations provided objective proof of the logistics gap that had decided the war. The corned beef that the American sergeant had so contemptuously discarded in that prisoner of war camp represented far more than a single unappetizing meal. It symbolized American industrial capacity to produce food in quantities that allowed wastefulness. It demonstrated logistics systems capable of delivering that food to any location where American forces operated. Most profoundly, it revealed the psychological gap between an army that took abundance for granted and an army that was slowly starving. When German generals gathered after the war to analyze their defeat, many focused on tactical decisions, strategic errors, or resource shortages. Some, however, understood that the war had been lost in the fields and factories that fed armies before it was lost on battlefields. General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, perhaps the Wehrmacht's most skilled operational commander, reflected on this in his memoirs. "We defeated ourselves through strategic overreach that our logistics could not sustain. The Eastern Front required food we could not supply. Our soldiers fought brilliantly while they had strength, but an army cannot fight on empty stomachs. The Americans understood what we did not. Modern warfare is won by the side that can sustain material consumption indefinitely. They could. We could not. All other considerations were secondary to that fundamental reality." The legacy of the food crisis shaped post-war German military thinking profoundly. When the Federal Republic of Germany established the Bundeswehr in 1955, logistics received emphasis that would have seemed excessive to Wehrmacht planners. The new German military studied American logistics methods intensively, adopting principles of redundancy, abundance, and supply security that Nazi Germany had dismissed as wasteful. German officers who had experienced hunger during the war ensured that post-war forces would never face similar deprivation. The emphasis on logistics that characterized NATO military doctrine during the Cold War drew heavily on World War II lessons about the decisive importance of supply systems. The corned beef in that tin can, dismissed by an American soldier who had never known hunger, had represented the victory that industrial democracy achieved over military dictatorship. The soldier's complaint about food quality, overheard by a German officer who understood its implications, had revealed the fundamental asymmetry that decided World War II. America could produce such abundance that its soldiers felt entitled to complain about menu options while Germany slowly starved. That disparity, more than any battle, demonstrated which side would prevail in protracted modern warfare. Today, military logistics doctrine worldwide reflects lessons learned during World War II about the decisive importance of supply systems. The principle that armies must be fed before they can fight seems obvious, yet Germany ignored this truth and paid the price. The millions of tons of food that American industry produced and American logistics delivered sustained the military effort that liberated Europe and defeated Nazi aggression. And it all came down to simple cans of corned beef that American soldiers complained about, while German soldiers would have died for them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.